Astrid Lindgren, Rasmus and the Vagabond. Chapter 1. The Lucky Day. Rasmus was sitting in his regular notch in the linden tree, thinking about things that shouldn't be allowed to exist. Potatoes were at the top of the list, cooked with gravy on them for Sunday dinner. They were all right, but when they kept on sprouting in the field and had to be dug up, then they shouldn't be tolerated. He could also easily do without Miss Hawk, for it was she who was always saying, "Tomorrow we're going to spend the day digging up potatoes." "We," she said, but of course that didn't include her. It was Rasmus, and Gunnar, and Big Peter, and the other boys, who had to slave in the potato field the whole hot summer day. To top it off, they had to watch the village kids troop by on their way to the swimming place down at the river. Snooty village kids they shouldn't be allowed around either. Rasmus was trying to think whether there was anything else he could put on his list to be done away with, but a hiss from below interrupted his deliberations. "Rasmus, hide, the hawk is coming." Gunnar had popped his head out of the woodshed door, and Rasmus moved fast. He slipped away from his perch in the tree, and when Miss Hawk, a second later, stood outside the woodshed, there was no Rasmus to be seen in the green branches of the linden. This was lucky for Rasmus, because Miss Hawk strongly disapproved of boys flitting about in trees like birds when there was useful work to be done. "Gunnar, I hope you're only cutting the spruce wood." Miss Hawk's steely eyes scrutinized the wood which Gunnar had gathered in the sack. "Yes, Miss Hawk," said Gunnar in the tone of voice he was supposed to use when he answered Miss Hawk. It was the special orphanage voice that had to use when talking to the directress, or to the parson when he came on an inspection visit and asked them if they didn't think it was fun to work in the garden, or when one of the village children's parents came to complain that their boy had been beaten up for shouting "orphan" in the schoolyard. Then the orphanage children had to put all the gentleness and obedience they could muster into their voices, because that is what was expected by Miss Hawk and the parson and everybody. "Do you know where Rasmus is?" said Miss Hawk. Alarmed, Rasmus pressed himself still closer to the branch from which he was dangling and prayed that Miss Hawk would go away. He couldn't keep hanging on like this much longer. His arms were starting to ache. They would gradually give, and he would sink down right in front of Miss Hawk. The blue and white striped orphanage shirt he was wearing didn't help any either. The birds in the tree were so hard to spot because God had given them protective coloring, the teacher had said, but God hadn't provided orphan boys with protective coloring, and therefore Rasmus begged God with all his heart to send Miss Hawk away before he dropped. It wasn't long since Miss Hawk had scolded him because he got himself dirtier than anyone else in the orphanage, but just wait. The next time she said anything like that, he would just say that he was working on his protective coloring. But he would say it to himself, of course. You didn't say such things so that the hawk heard them, because her eyes were so steely and her mouth was so hard, and sometimes the wrinkles in her forehead were so severe. Gunnar claimed that even her nose was severe, but Rasmus didn't agree. In fact, he thought the hawk had quite a nice nose, although hanging in the tree in this agonizing position, his arms going to sleep, he could hardly think of anything nice about the hawk. Gunnar was trembling as he kept piling wood into the sack, while Miss Hawk stood by watching. He didn't even dare raise his eyes as high as her nose. All he saw of her was a bit of her stiffly starched apron. "Do you know where Rasmus is?" Miss Hawk repeated impatiently, since she hadn't received an answer to her first question. "I saw him a while ago over by the chicken coop," said Gunnar. That was the honest-to-goodness truth. Half an hour ago Gunnar and Rasmus had been looking for eggs in the nettles behind the chicken coop, where the silly hens would sometimes sneak off to lay their eggs. So Gunnar had seen Rasmus there, but his present whereabouts Gunnar thought it would be better if Miss Hawk didn't know. "If you see him, tell him that he has to pull up a basket full of nettles," said Miss Hawk, abruptly turning on her heels and leaving. "Yes, Miss Hawk," said Gunnar. "Did you hear that?" he said when Rasmus came climbing down from the linden tree. "You're to pull up a basket full of nettles." Nettles shouldn't be allowed to exist either, Rasmus thought. All summer the boys had to pick the nettles for the hens who ate them boiled every day. Can't those stupid hens eat the nettles when they grow right under their beaks? "Of course they can't," said Gunnar. "They have to be served properly, if you please." He made a deep bow to a hen who came strutting idly along, cackling. Rasmus wasn't sure whether hens should be wiped out or not, but he finally decided in favor of letting them live. Without hens there wouldn't be eggs for Sunday breakfast, and without eggs on Sunday it would be hard to tell what day it was. Since hens had to be, he might as well get to work and pull up those nettles. Rasmus wasn't any lazier than any other 9-year-old. He just had a natural dislike of everything which kept him from climbing trees, or swimming in the river, or playing robbers with the other boys, and lying in ambush behind the potato cellar when the girls would come to fetch potatoes. This was his idea of time well spent, but it wasn't Miss Hawk's, and that was quite natural. Vesterhaga Orphanage was a municipal institution which got part of its income by selling eggs and vegetables. The children were a cheap and necessary labor force, and Miss Hawk didn't put any inhuman demands on them, even if Rasmus considered it inhuman to make him dig up potatoes all day. But since he and the other orphans would have to support themselves when they reached the age of 13, it was necessary for them to learn to work. This was Miss Hawk's understanding, but unfortunately she did not understand how necessary it was for children, even in an orphanage, to play. But perhaps this was too much to expect, since she herself had never been very fond of playing. Rasmus was obediently pulling up nettles behind the chicken coop, but as he worked he told the chickens what he thought of them. "Lazy critters like you shouldn't be allowed. Nettles are growing around here like crazy, but no, that won't do. I have to work like a slave and pull them up for you." The more he thought about it, the more he began to feel like a slave, and it was quite fun. Last term his teacher had read them a book about slavery in America a long time ago. He liked nothing better than to have the teacher read to them, and the book about slavery was the most exciting story Rasmus had ever heard. He groaned as he pulled up the nettles because now he could feel the slave driver's whip on him, and there were bloodhounds behind the ice house ready to attack him if he didn't fill the basket fast enough. It was American cotton he was picking now, not Swedish nettles. The big mitten he was wearing, in order not to get a nettle burn, was not exactly what one would expect a slave to be wearing under the burning southern sun, but he just couldn't do without it. Rasmus tugged and pulled, but sometimes even slaves have nice things happen to them. Several enormous nettles were growing over by the ice house, and though by now Rasmus had his basket full, he went over and ripped them out just the same to tease the bloodhounds. Then all of a sudden his eye caught something lying in the sawdust next to the ice house. It was partly covered with sawdust, but it looked quite a lot like a coin. Rasmus' heart beat faster. It couldn't be real money, such things didn't happen, but just the same he pulled off his mitten and stretched out his hand to grab it. It was a 5-cent piece. The cotton fields vanished, the bloodhounds too, and the poor slave stood there dizzy, his head spinning with elation. It seemed to Rasmus that 5 cents would buy just about anything he wanted, a big bag of candy, or 5 pieces of toffee, or a chocolate bar. Perhaps he could run down to the village candy store during lunch hour tomorrow, or else he could hold on to the money in the happy thought that he was rich and could buy anything he wanted. Now chickens should definitely be allowed, and nettles too, because without chickens and nettles this would never have happened. He was sorry that he had been so unfriendly to the poor chickens a while ago, judging by the way they were strutting around in the chicken coop. Their feelings didn't seem to have been hurt too much, but he still wanted them to know that he didn't have anything against them. "You certainly should be allowed to exist," he said as he walked over to the chicken coop. "I'm going to pull up nettles for you every day." Then a new miracle happened. He saw another treasure. A seashell was lying at the feet of a cackling leghorn hen. Right in the middle of all the chicken dirt lay a beautiful white shell with small brown spots. "Oh," said Rasmus, "oh." He quickly unhooked the gate to the chicken coop, and without paying the slightest attention to the wild scurrying in every direction, he rushed in and grabbed the shell. His delight was so great that he felt unable to bear it alone. He just had to tell Gunnar all about it. Poor Gunnar, who had been with him at the chicken coop only an hour ago and hadn't found a shell or a 5-cent piece. Rasmus became thoughtful. Perhaps neither the shell nor the coin had been there an hour ago. Perhaps they had got there by some sort of magic, just when he began pulling up nettles. Maybe this was to be his lucky day, when only fantastic things happened. He'd better ask Gunnar what he thought about it. Rasmus started to run, but suddenly stopped when he remembered the basket of nettles. He went back to the ice house to pick it up, and with the basket in one hand and the coin held tightly in the other, he ran to look for Gunnar. He found him over at the playground where the children gathered when their work was over for the day. The whole group was together, and everyone seemed tense and anxious. Something must have happened while Rasmus was away. Rasmus was eager to get Gunnar off by himself and show him his treasures. But Gunnar had more important things to talk about. "We're not going to dig up potatoes tomorrow," he informed Rasmus. "Some people are coming tomorrow to pick out a kid." In the face of this news, the coin and the shell faded into the background. Nothing could be as important as the possibility that someone in the group would get a home of his own. There wasn't a child at Vesterhaga who wasn't dreaming of that. Even the bigger boys and girls who would soon be ready to go out on their own hoped against all reason for such a miracle. Even the ugliest and most impossible of them wouldn't stop hoping that someday someone would come who, for some strange reason, wonderful, unexplainable reason, wanted just him or her, not as a servant to order around, but as their own child. To have parents was the greatest joy the children at the orphanages could imagine. Not all of them would admit their hopeless longing openly, but Rasmus was only 9 and too young to hide his heart. "Just think," he said eagerly, "if they should pick me, oh, how I wish they would want me." "Bah, don't get any ideas," said Gunnar. They always pick girls with curly hair." Rasmus' spirits sank, and an expression of black despair spread over his face. He looked pleadingly at Gunnar. "Don't you think there might be a chance that someone would want a boy with straight hair?" "They want girls with curly hair, I told you." Gunnar was an unusually homely boy with a pug nose, and hair as coarse as a goat's. He kept his dreams and hopes of having a father and mother a deep secret. No one would ever have guessed that he cared in the least who would be chosen tomorrow. Later, lying in his narrow bed beside Gunnar's in the boys' dormitory, Rasmus remembered that he still hadn't told him about the shell and the coin. He leaned over and whispered, "Gunnar, listen, so many strange things have happened today." "What sort of things?" asked Gunnar. "I found a 5-cent piece and a beautiful shell, but don't tell anybody." "Let me see," whispered Gunnar, who was now curious. "Come, let's go over to the window so I can see." They tiptoed over to the window in their nightshirts, and in the clear light of the summer twilight Rasmus showed off his treasures, carefully so that no one could see. "How lucky you are," said Gunnar, running his index finger over the smooth shell. "Yes, I'm lucky, and because I am, the people who are coming tomorrow might want me." "Listen to him," scoffed Gunnar. Big Peter, the oldest of the boys at the orphanage and self-appointed leader, was in the bed next to the door. He had raised himself on his elbow and was listening tensely. "Get into bed," he whispered. "The hawk is coming. I hear her clomping up the stairs." Gunnar and Rasmus made a dash for the beds, their nightshirts flapping around their bare legs, and when the hawk came into the dormitory, you could have heard a pin drop. The directress was making her nightly rounds, going from bed to bed to make sure everybody was settled down. Very rarely she would give one of the boys a reluctant pat on the head as she came by. Rasmus didn't like the hawk, but every night he wished that she would stroke him. He didn't know why. "If she comes by and strokes me tonight," thought Rasmus as he lay there, "it means that I'll have luck tomorrow too. It will mean that the people who are coming will want me, even though my hair is straight." Now Miss Hawk was close to Gunnar's bed. Rasmus lay stiff with suspense. Now, she would be coming to him. "Rasmus, don't lie there picking holes in the blanket," was all she said. Then she continued her inspection, and in the next minute she had closed the door behind her, calmly, firmly, sternly. All was quiet in the dormitory, but for Rasmus came a deep sigh. Chapter 2. Disappointment. Lots of soap was used in the boys' washroom the next morning. Clean ears and scrubbed hands were the first things foster parents looked for, if you could believe the hawk, and today everyone was anxious to put his best foot forward. Rasmus grabbed a piece of soap and started to scrub himself more thoroughly than he had since the day before Christmas Eve. He was a boy, and he did have straight hair. That couldn't be changed. But if it was only a question of the ears, he would show up with the cleanest ears in all of Västerhaga, and no one's hand would be redder from scrubbing than his. The girls had an advantage there too, for they were unnaturally clean. It seemed that dirt didn't stick to them in the same way that it did to boys. And besides, they were always doing dishes, scrubbing floors and baking and things like that, so they got clean without trying. Big Peter was standing in the middle of the floor. He still hadn't touched his soap or his brush. He was going to be 13 in the fall, and he would have to leave Västerhaga whether he wanted to or not. He knew that he would have to start working as a farmhand for some farmer in the vicinity, and he also knew that no matter how thoroughly he washed his ears, nothing could change that. "I'm not going to wash today," he announced in a loud voice. There was a sudden pause in the scrubbing at the basins. Big Peter was the leader, and he wasn't going to wash. Now the problem was to decide what the rest of them were going to do. "I'm not going to wash either," said Gunnar, putting his brush down with a bang. He was also aware that soap and water couldn't accomplish any miracles as far as his looks were concerned. "Have you gone crazy?" asked Rasmus, pushing his wet hair out of his eyes. "You know who is coming. You seem to think that it's old King Oscar come back to life," said Gunnar. "I don't care whether it's the king or a junk dealer from Kisa. I'm not going to wash, that's all." Aunt Olga, the cook, who was more talkative than Miss Hawk, had said that the man who was coming was a rich grocer, which was certainly far from being a junk dealer. He was bringing his wife along. They didn't have any children of their own to inherit the business one day, and that is why they were coming to Vastaraga, to inherit a whole business. That would be something, thought Rasmus. Just imagine having a store filled with all kinds of candy. Of course, they probably had things like flour and coffee and soap and herring too. "Anyway, I'm going to wash," he said, with determination, and started to scrub his elbows. "You just keep on scrubbing," said Gunnar. "I'll help you." He grabbed Rasmus by the neck and quickly dunked his head in the basin. Rasmus came up, spluttering and furious, while Gunnar stood laughing with his friendly, pug-nosed face. "You aren't mad, I hope," he said teasingly. Then Rasmus laughed too. He never could stay angry at Gunnar for very long, but he intended to give him a good soaking anyway. He picked up the basin and stalked threateningly toward Gunnar, who stood in front of the dormitory door, awaiting his attack. Rasmus raised the basin. Now Gunnar was really going to get it, but just as he aimed, his target quickly jumped to one side. At the same instant the door opened, and like a violent tropical torrent, the contents of the basin splashed over the person standing in the doorway. That person was Miss Hawk. When such a thing happens, the only one who can keep from laughing is the one who gets drenched. Miss Hawk was far from laughing, but from the boys came muffled giggles, and from Rasmus a shrill, terrified laugh. It lasted for only an instant, and then he stood struck dumb with horror, waiting for the catastrophe, because there would be one, of that he was sure. Miss Hawk was a person with a great deal of self-control, which she used now. All she did was shake herself like a wet dog, and fix a pair of steely eyes on Rasmus. "I don't have time for you now," she said, "but I'll see you later." Then she clapped her hands and cried, "You are all to gather in the yard in half an hour. By that time you will have made the beds, cleaned the dormitory, and had breakfast." Then she left without even glancing at Rasmus. When she had disappeared, Bedlam broke out. "Gosh, what a soaking she got," said Big Peter. "That time you hit the bull's eye, Rasmus." But Rasmus couldn't share the general enthusiasm over his aim. This day certainly wasn't beginning very well. It didn't look as if this day were going to mark the turning point in his life, when he would get parents of his own. Punishment was what he was in for, probably terrible punishment, since what he had done was so terrible. He shivered and his whole body was shaking. "Get dressed," said Gunnar. "You're so cold. You're turning blue in the face." He added in a subdued voice, "It was all my fault that you threw water on the Hawk." Still shivering, Rasmus got his shirt and pants on. It didn't make any difference whose fault it was. Neither of them had dreamed that their pranks would have such dreadful consequences. But he was afraid, terribly afraid, of what the Hawk would think up as punishment for him. If any of them did anything really bad, Miss Hawk would beat him with a cane. Big Peter had been thrashed once when he had stolen apples from the parson's garden, and Elof had also gotten a beating the morning he flew into a rage at Aunt Olga in the kitchen and called her a glutton, so that the hawk heard it. But to pour water over the directress was probably even worse than stealing apples and calling someone a glutton. He was sure that the hawk would take him to a room and beat him with a cane. If she beats me, I'll die, thought Rasmus. I'll die on the spot, and that's just as well. After all, he was an orphan with straight hair whom no one wanted, and he might as well be dead. He was as miserable as ever when he came out in the yard, where the others were assembled. Miss Hawk was already there, dressed in a neat black dress and a starched white apron. She clapped her hands and said, "As you've probably heard, we're going to have a visit today from a lady and gentleman who will be here in a while to look you over and have a talk with you. You are to behave as usual. It would be preferable, of course, if you behaved better than usual. Now start playing." Rasmus didn't want to play. He didn't feel as if he would ever want to play again. Instead, he climbed up to his usual perch in the linden tree. There he could be alone to think things out, and he could also keep an eye on the road so that he could see the people arriving. Even if he no longer held any hope that they would choose him, it would still be interesting to see what they looked like. As he sat there under his green arch, waiting, he took the shell and the 5-cent piece out of his pocket and looked at them. It felt good to hold them in his hand. "My treasures," he murmured fondly, "my fine treasures." Despite all his misfortunes, he couldn't help feeling just a little happy about them. In the distance he heard the faint clatter of horses' hoofs. The sound grew louder, and soon a coach was visible at the bend of the road. 2 brown horses were trotting along briskly in the dust. When the carriage arrived at the gate, the coachman halted them with a loud "Whoa!" In the coach were a gentleman and a lady, and oh, how beautiful she was! She was wearing a tiny blue hat with white feathers swaying on her blonde hair, which was piled up high on the top of her head, and she carried a white lace parasol to protect her from the sun. The parasol was tilted back, so Rasmus was able to see her lovely face. Her cotton dress was also lovely, with its wide, sweeping skirt, and when she got out of the carriage, she held it up with her small white hand. Rasmus thought that she looked just like a fairy. The chubby little man who helped her out wasn't at all handsome. He certainly didn't look as if he came out of a fairy tale, but he did have a store filled with candy and licorice sticks, and that made up for a lot. The lady with the parasol walked with dainty little steps through the gate, which her husband held open for her. Rasmus leaned forward as far as he could, so that he wouldn't miss the least detail of her fairy-like appearance. How would it feel to have someone like that for a mother? Mother, he said to himself, just to hear how it sounded. Oh, if this would turn out to be his lucky day after all! Then the beautiful lady would know right away that no one in all of Vesterhaga would be a better son than he. As soon as she saw him, she would say, "That boy with the straight hair is exactly what I'm looking for." Then the grocer would nod and say, yes, he might be useful around the store. Perhaps he could be in charge of the candy counter. And when Miss Hawk would come to take him to her room for a beating, the grocer would say, "Please don't touch our boy." Then they would take him along in the carriage, and he would hold the pretty lady's hand. The hawk would be standing at the gate with her cane, just gaping as the carriage rolled along the road, and the sound of hoofs died away. She would cry a little and say, "There goes Rasmus." He sighed. If there only weren't so many girls with curls in the world. Greta and Anna Steina and Elna, 3 of them in this orphanage alone. Ellen, too, but she was queer, so they probably wouldn't want her. Quickly he scrambled down from the tree. The grocer and his wife were already in the yard, and any minute they could pick a curly-haired girl. He would at least show himself before then, and then they could blame themselves if they didn't want him. With determination he strode toward the yard, where Miss Hawk had just welcomed the visitors. "Let's have some coffee in the garden while we are discussing the situation," she said, giving them her biggest smile. "You can be looking the children over in the meantime." The pretty lady also smiled and looked shyly around the group of children. "Yes, then we can decide." Her husband gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "Fine," he said. "Now we'll have some coffee while we talk." The children were playing ball in the playground close by. They had been told to play, and that is what they were doing. But it was a chore, and no one was enjoying it. How could they play when their whole future depended on how they conducted themselves and how they happened to look that morning? Many furtive glances were cast in the direction of the 3 who were sitting at the table by the lilac bush. There was an oppressive silence at the playground. No one quarreled, no one laughed. The only sound that could be heard was the smack of the bat hitting the ball, and it was a strangely painful sound this quiet summer morning. Like a frightened lamb who has been separated from the flock, Rasmus came running from behind the lilac bush. He had no idea that Miss Hawk and her guests were sitting at the garden table, and when he discovered them it was too late to turn back and go another way. He had to pass directly in front of them, and he did so with a pained expression on his face and walked as if his legs were made of wood. He glanced at Miss Hawk out of the corner of his eye. He was close to her, much too close for comfort, and in his hurry to get away and join the rest of the group, he stumbled all over the place. He also glanced at the pretty lady who just at that moment looked at him. He froze to the spot and just stood there, staring, embarrassed. "Rasmus," said Miss Hawk sharply, but she stopped short. After all, these people had come to look at the children. "Oh, is your name Rasmus?" said the pretty lady. Rasmus was unable to answer. He only nodded. "How about making a bow when you introduce yourself?" "Would you like a cookie?" said the lady, taking one from the basket. Rasmus blushed and made a hasty bow, at the same time looking in Miss Hawk's direction. Was he allowed to take the cookie or not? Miss Hawk nodded, and Rasmus accepted it. "How about saying thank you when someone gives you something?" Miss Hawk said. Rasmus became still redder. He stood there, twisting and turning, not knowing what to do. He didn't dare eat the cookie, and he didn't know if he was supposed to leave or stay. "Run along and play now," said Miss Hawk, and Rasmus turned and abruptly ran as fast as his legs could carry him. Miserable, he sat down on the lawn next to the playground and ate his cookie. He had behaved like a fool, standing there so stupidly, and not having the sense to bow and say thank you. Now the lady must think that he was pretty hopeless. The sun was almost directly overhead now. It was a clear, beautiful summer day, and they didn't have to dig up potatoes. But it was a terrible day of suspense for the children of Vasterhaga. The ball playing soon came to an end, and no one had the courage even to pretend that it was fun. They didn't know how to use this unusual free time which had been given to them, and which they knew would last exactly as long as it took those people to make up their minds. Never had a morning seemed so long. They stood around in small, listless groups, watching the lady with the parasol. Her husband remained at the table reading the paper. It was obviously his wife who was going to make the choice. The lady walked from group to group. She talked with them, embarrassed and a little shy. She didn't exactly know what to say to all these poor creatures who were staring at her so pathetically. There was the little boy Rasmus. He was staring more intently than the rest, and there was a pleading look in his eyes, which were dark and seemed much too big for his narrow, freckled face. But there were others whose eyes also had an imploring look. There was that little chubby girl with the red cheeks and a mop of blonde, curly hair falling over her forehead. It was impossible to avoid her because she clung like a burr. She was a bold little thing, the only one of the children who dared to smile back. The lady stroked her cheek and said encouragingly, "What is your name, little girl?" "Greta," she said, and made a pretty curtsy. "What a pretty parasol you have." The white lace parasol was indeed pretty. The lady gave it a twirl, but as she did so, she happened to drop it on the lawn. Before she could bend down to pick it up, Greta was there, but not only Greta. Rasmus had been standing close by, as close to the pretty lady as he could get. He pounced on the parasol. At last he would have a chance to show that he could be polite. "Let go," Greta cried, tugging at the parasol. "No, let me," said Rasmus. "Let go," cried Greta again, and she gave another tug. Suddenly Rasmus stood there staring dumbfounded at a loose handle in his hand. Greta was holding the rest of the parasol. She was just horrified. When she finally realized what had happened, she started to cry. Miss Hawk came running to the scene. "Rasmus, you are impossible," she said. "I think you've gone out of your mind today. Will you ever learn to behave decently?" Tears of shame and embarrassment came into Rasmus' eyes, and he blushed violently. The lady stood there, unhappy at seeing so much heartbreak. "It's nothing," she said kindly. "The handle can be screwed back on. My husband can fix it." She took the broken parasol and hurried over to her husband, who was still sitting at the table. Greta quickly dried her eyes and trotted behind like a little dog. She stopped a few paces away and watched with interest as the grocer screwed the handle back on the parasol. "I'm so glad you could fix it," she said, smiling, her blonde curls shimmering in the sun. But Rasmus had disappeared. He had retreated to the bathroom to hide his shame and his unmanly tears. It was a peaceful place to lick your wounds, and the best place to forget unhappy things. Among the pile of newspapers lying there, he could always find something interesting to read, and for the moment he was able to forget all the grocers' wives and lace parasols in this whole cruel world. Rasmus sat there deeply engrossed in his reading. He had stumbled on something really exciting. Eagerly he spelled his way through the article, which read, "Robbery at Sandow Factory. A daring hold-up took place yesterday at Sandow Factory. 2 masked bandits forced their way into the office and with pointed guns escaped with the week's payroll for the entire factory without leaving any traces." Rasmus saw those masked men before his eyes, and he shivered with excitement. Just now the pretty lady was far from his mind, but when the visitors left Vasterhaga a few hours later, he stood at the gate and stared after the carriage, long after it was out of sight. In the back seat was Greta, her blonde head next to the blue hat with the feathers, and holding the pretty lady securely by the hand. Chapter 3. It's all over now. "What did I tell you?" said Gunnar, when the carriage had disappeared. "They always pick girls with curly hair." Rasmus nodded. It was true, all right. Boys didn't have a chance if there were girls with curly hair around. Still, he refused to give up the hope that somewhere in the world there could be someone who would like to have a boy with straight hair. Someone, somewhere, far beyond that bend in the road. "You know what we could do," said Rasmus eagerly. "We could take off and look for parents ourselves." "What are you talking about? What parents?" Gunnar didn't follow. "Parents who would want you. If there was no one else to choose from, they would have to take you, even if you didn't have curly hair. Sure, you ought to go up to Miss Hawk and say, 'Please excuse me, I can't dig up potatoes today because I'm going out to look for someone who wants me. You're crazy.'" "Stupid, we'd take off without asking Miss Hawk, of course." "Well, go ahead and run away," said Gunnar. "You'll probably come back when you're good and hungry, and if you've never had a beating before, you'll get it then." A beating, Gunnar had said. A shock went through Rasmus. How could he have forgotten the terrible thing that was awaiting him? The hawk was going to beat him with a cane. He was almost sure of that. The thought made his blood run cold. "Come on, let's play ball with the others," said Gunnar. "Or are you planning to leave right away?" Gunnar put his arm around Rasmus' shoulders. He was nice, Gunnar was, and his arm was comforting. Rasmus felt calmer as he walked over to the playground with Gunnar. The others were standing in a circle around Big Peter, who, with an affected smile and mincing walk, was imitating the grocer's wife. "What's your name, my little friend?" he said, and petted Alof on the bed. "Do you like it at Vasterhaga? Have you ever seen an automobile? Did you ever wet your pants?" None of them had heard the grocer's wife say the last part, but they all laughed gleefully. It felt good to be able to make fun of the person who had caused so much secret anguish, and so much longing, and who would never come back. Looking pretty in a blue hat and carrying a lace parasol. "Here is the boy with the basin," shouted Big Peter, when Rasmus and Gunnar approached. "What sort of water tricks are you planning to play on the hawk tomorrow?" Rasmus was in no mood to talk about the water tricks. "But when Big Peter condescended to talk to you, you had to play along. Well, perhaps I can borrow the garden hose and spray her a bit," he said with a superior air. Everyone laughed, and Rasmus, encouraged by his success, continued, "Or else I may use the big fire extinguisher to give her a good soaking." Oddly enough, no one laughed at that. They all suddenly stood in dead silence, staring at something behind Rasmus. With a sinking feeling in his stomach, he turned around to see what it was. It was the hawk, dressed in her good hat and her black coat with the puff sleeves. She was on her way to a coffee party at the vicarage. Why, oh why, did she have to come sneaking up here just at this moment? "So you're going to give me a soaking, are you?" said Miss Hawk, and there was almost a look of amusement on her face. "Come to my room tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, and we'll see who is going to get the soaking." "Yes, Hawk, miss," stammered Rasmus, beside himself with mortification. Miss Hawk shook her head in despair. "Hawk, miss, I don't know what has gotten into you today, Rasmus." Then she left, and Rasmus stood there, knowing that all was lost. Nothing could save him this time, that was sure. He would be thrashed with a cane, and he knew himself that he had deserved it. You couldn't do as much mischief in one day as he had done without being punished. "Bah, she doesn't hit so hard," said Big Peter, consolingly. "It isn't so bad. You don't have to go around looking as if your last hour had come." But Rasmus had never in his life been beaten with a cane, and he was sure he wouldn't be able to stand it. Nothing could make him go through with it. Oh, why wasn't he sitting in the carriage next to the grocer's wife right now, watching Vasterhaga disappear forever? There was only one thing for him to do: run away. He couldn't lie in bed all night knowing that as soon as it was morning he would have to go to Miss Hawk and be beaten. But he could hardly run away alone. Gunnar had to come along. He just had to. Rasmus was going to talk to him and beg him to come along. There was no time to lose. They would have to leave in a couple of hours. The long day was over. It was bedtime, but they all delayed going indoors as long as they could, since the hawk was away. Aunt Olga was keeping track of the time, but she had no authority. The girls obediently went inside when they were called, but she had to drive the boys ahead of her like a flock of unwilling cattle. No one wanted to go indoors on a beautiful summer evening like this. Rasmus kept close to Gunnar, and while they were undressing he whispered, "Gunnar, I'm going to run away tonight, and you have to come with me." Impatiently Gunnar shoved him aside. "Stop talking such nonsense. Why on earth would you do that?" Rasmus didn't want to admit, even to Gunnar, that it was fear of the cane which drove him away. "I'm through with this old place," he said. "I'm going to look for another place to live." "Well, go then," said Gunnar, unconcerned. "But I feel sorry for you when you come back." "I'll never come back." The words sounded frightening, and Rasmus shuddered as he said them. He had been at Vasterhaga ever since he was a baby. He didn't remember any other home or any other mother than Miss Hawk. In a way, it was awful to think of leaving for good. It certainly would seem strange never to see the hawk again, come to think of it, not because he liked her, but still. He remembered one night several years ago when he had an earache. She had taken him in her lap. He had leaned his sore ear against her arm, and she had sung him a lullaby. He had liked her so much then, and he had liked her for a long, long time afterward, and almost hoped for another earache, but he didn't get one, and Miss Hawk had never again paid any attention to him, and hardly ever stroked him when she made her nightly rounds, and now she was going to beat him. It would serve her right if he ran away, but even so it sounded horrible to say that he was never coming back. Then there was Gunnar. If he didn't come along, Rasmus would probably never see him again either. That would be worse than anything else. Gunnar, his best friend, never to see him again. They had their beds next to each other in the dormitory. They sat next to each other in school, and once behind the chicken coop they had become blood brothers by pricking their arms and then mixing each other's blood. Now Gunnar didn't want to run away. Rasmus was hurt and angry. "Are you going to hang around Vasterhaga until the moss grows on you?" "We'll talk about that when you come back," said Gunnar. "I'm never coming back," said Rasmus emphatically, and again the words frightened him as he spoke them. At first there was bedlam in the dormitory. Big Peter said you could get away with anything when Aunt Olga was in charge. This was a night to have fights and horse around and make noise and put off going to bed. But then Aunt Olga came in, furious and red as a beet, threatening to tell Miss Hawk. The time had come to get into bed, but they didn't have to quiet down just yet. "I'm a prince of royal blood," said Albin over in his corner. That was the way he always began. Prince Albin of the Blood, they called him. He claimed that his father was a member of the royal family and that he, Albin, had landed at Vasterhaga by mistake. "All this happened when I was a baby," said Albin. "But when I grow up, I'm going to find my father. Then you'll really see something. All of you who have been nice to me will get presents, lots of presents." "Thank you, Your Majesty," said Big Peter. "Tell us what sort of presents we'll get." This was a never-ending game. No one but Albin believed he was a prince of the blood, and no one but Albin thought that he would ever be in a position to give away so much as a penny. But They all longed for presents which they had never got and would never get. So they listened eagerly to Alban, who, while lying in bed at night, would give away bicycles, books, skates, and games to everyone in sight. Rasmus had always enjoyed playing this game, but tonight he had only one wish, that they all would fall asleep as quickly as possible. He was all nerves lying there. It was as if all the misfortunes of the day had got under his skin, and were working together to drive him away. Outside the open window, the summer night was clear and still. Everything was so peaceful, and there were no canes threatening. Perhaps, too, somewhere far away, there would be a place for orphans with straight hair that would be better than Vasterhaga. He dozed off, but his anxiety awakened him, and he felt that the moment had come. There was no sound in the dormitory now, except Elof's snoring, which could be heard over the quiet breathing of the others. Cautiously Rasmus sat up, his eyes wandering along the rows of beds to make sure that everyone was asleep. Yes, the coast was clear. Prince Alban was mumbling in his sleep, and Emil was tossing as usual, but they all slept, including Gunnar. Then he lay peacefully with his shaggy head on the pillow, not caring that his best friend was about to disappear forever from Vasterhaga orphanage. Rasmus took a deep breath. How sad Gunnar would be when he woke up in the morning and saw that Rasmus really had run away. Gunnar would not have told him so calmly to go ahead if he had believed that Rasmus was serious. He just didn't understand that Rasmus couldn't stay there knowing what was in store for him. Again Rasmus sighed deeply. The other boys didn't seem to think that the business with the cane was anything to worry about. Apparently Rasmus was the only one who felt that he would rather die than be beaten. He crept out of bed as quietly as he could and got dressed without making a sound. His heart was pounding fast, and his legs felt stiff and queer. They didn't seem to want to run away the way they were trembling. He put his hand in his pants pocket. There were the shell and the coin. 5 cents wouldn't get him very far, but it would save him once from starving. It would buy him a bun and some milk, but the shell, so beautiful to look at and so smooth to touch, he would leave to Gunnar as a remembrance of his childhood friend gone forever. When he woke up in the morning, there would be no Rasmus next to him, but the beautiful shell would be lying on his bed. Rasmus swallowed hard as he put the shell next to his friend. For a while he stood there, struggling against the tears and listening to Gunnar's deep breathing. Then he put his hand on the pillow, and with a chapped, dirty forefinger he gently stroked Gunnar's coarse hair. He wanted to touch his very best friend, since this was probably the last time he would ever see him. "Goodbye, Gunnar," he mumbled. Then he tiptoed toward the door. He stopped and listened, his heart pounding loudly. Then he opened the door with a hand which was clammy and shaking, furious at the door because it creaked as if it wanted to give him away. The steps down to the kitchen also creaked noisily. Just suppose he should meet the hawk. What would he say then? That he had a stomachache and had to go to the bathroom. He could never make the hawk believe that if he met her on the kitchen steps, he would see if he could find something to eat to take along with him. He tried the pantry door. It was locked. There wasn't even a crust in any of the bread boxes, but he did find one small zwieback, which he put in his pocket. The kitchen window was open. He would only have to climb up on the table in front of the window, and then with one leap he would be free. But just at that moment he heard steps in the gravel outside, steps which were only too familiar. It was the hawk coming home from the coffee party at the Viceroy. Rasmus' legs seemed to wilt under him. There was no way out. If the hawk came in through the kitchen door, it was the end. There would be no possible way of explaining his presence in the kitchen at 11 o'clock at night. He listened, stiff with fright. Perhaps there was just the faintest hope that she would go along the veranda. She didn't. He heard her steps on the kitchen porch. She put her hand on the door knob. Rasmus' paralyzed legs suddenly came to life, and he threw himself down under the drop-leaf table. He pulled and tugged at the oilcloth cover to get it to hide as much of him as possible. The next instant Miss Hawk was standing in the kitchen. Rasmus felt as if his last moment had come. It just wasn't possible to be so terrified and still alive. He could hardly stand the way his heart was pounding. It was ready to burst. Every corner of the big old-fashioned kitchen was lit by the pale glow of the summer night. Miss Hawk would only have to lower her eyes ever so slightly, and she would see Rasmus crouching there under the table like a scared rabbit. But Miss Hawk seemed to have other things on her mind. She was standing in the middle of the floor, mumbling to herself, "Worries, worries, worries, nothing but worries." Although Rasmus was half out of his wits, he couldn't keep from wondering what Miss Hawk meant. What sort of worries could she possibly have? Well, he would never have a chance to find out now. As he watched her standing there, pulling the hat-pin out of her hat, it was probably the last time he would ever see her. At least he hoped so. With a deep sigh, Miss Hawk walked out of the kitchen. The little bang as the door closed behind her was the most wonderful sound Rasmus had ever heard. He remained crouched under the table for a few tense moments, listening. Then he quickly crawled up on the windowsill and jumped out, landing on the lawn with a thud. The grass was wet from the dew and felt cold under his bare feet. The night air was chilly, but it was good to breathe because it was the air of freedom. He was free, thank goodness he was free. But he had rejoiced too soon. A new sound again frightened him half out of his wits. The window of Miss Hawk's room on the upper floor was suddenly opened. He heard her unfasten the lock, and there she stood, tall and black, staring out toward him. Frantic, he pressed himself against the trunk of an apple tree, as if he wanted to disappear into it. He held his breath. "Is there anyone there?" the hawk called out. Rasmus shuddered when he heard the familiar voice. He realized that it was best to answer before she discovered him. It would only make things worse if he kept still, but he couldn't get a word through his trembling lips, and all he could do was stand there and stare up, terror-stricken, toward the dark figure in the window. He was sure that she was looking right at him, and he expected her to call his name at any moment. Oddly enough, she didn't, but abruptly closed the window and disappeared into the room. Rasmus heaved a sigh of relief. He could see her moving about up there. A light was turned on, and he saw her shadow against the wall, with the blue flowered wallpaper and the photograph of the royal family. To think that he would never again see that picture, or the one with Jesus before Pilate, which hung on the opposite wall. That was too bad, because he had enjoyed looking at those pictures when he had been allowed to come into the hawk's room on some rare occasion. But that was over now. Tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock he wouldn't be here, that was sure. He was very anxious to get away, but he couldn't seem to make himself move as long as he saw the shadow on the wall up there. It was uncanny feeling to be standing out here watching the hawk without her knowing it. "Goodbye, Hawk," he said to himself. "If you had been a little nicer to me when you made your nightly rounds, perhaps I would have stayed, but it's all over now." Perhaps the hawk could hear his thoughts, because now she was pulling down the shade. It was as if she were saying goodbye and were closing Vasterhaga orphanage to him and leaving him alone out in the night. For a moment longer he stood in the shadow of the apple tree looking at his former home. It was an old white house, and tonight it looked so beautiful, with its dark windows surrounded by big trees. To Rasmus, at least, it was beautiful, though Aunt Olga was always saying that it was an awful old barn, impossible to keep clean, but there must be better houses to live in, thought Rasmus, so he didn't have to feel sad about leaving. He would probably find a very good home. There must be other grocers' wives in the world. He started to run across the wet grass, between the apple trees and down to the gate. Outside the road wound before him like a ribbon. He kept on running farther into the summer night.